By early 1945, the war in the Pacific was closing in on Japan. On the remote island of Ramree, off the coast of Burma, a seasoned garrison of over 1,000 Imperial Japanese soldiers found themselves outmaneuvered and besieged by British forces. Their position was hopeless, their supply lines cut. The British Royal Marines established a tight perimeter, expecting a fierce last stand or a surrender. Instead, the Japanese commander made a desperate and fateful choice. Rather than surrender to the enemy, he ordered his remaining 900 to 1,000 men to abandon their stronghold and retreat through the island's interior. Their only escape route was a harrowing 10-mile trek through a dense, unforgiving mangrove swamp. It was a primordial landscape of thick, black, sucking mud, tangled roots, and stagnant water. This was an ecosystem that had remained unchanged for millennia, and it was home to a terrifying array of apex predators. As the Japanese soldiers plunged into the swamp's embrace, the conditions immediately became hellish. The thick mud clung to their legs, making every step an exhausting struggle. Swarms of mosquitoes and other venomous insects descended upon them, their bites raising painful welts. The stench of decay hung heavy in the air. The British, positioned on the swamp's perimeter, could only watch and listen. They heard the occasional shout or curse from the struggling column, but they held their fire, content to let the swamp do their work for them. They had no idea of the true horror that was about to unfold within the darkness. As night fell, the swamp transformed. Unseen things began to move in the brackish water. The soldiers, already suffering from dehydration, disease, and fatigue, started to notice large, dark shapes gliding silently beneath the surface. A primal fear, older than any war, began to creep into their hearts. Then the first scream echoed through the night. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated terror, abruptly cut short by a violent splash. Panic erupted. More screams followed from different parts of the column as massive saltwater crocodiles, some reportedly reaching 20 feet in length, launched their attack. The night became a cacophony of horror. The scattered rifle shots of the terrified soldiers were drowned out by the snapping of immense jaws and the piercing shrieks of men being dragged to their deaths. The crocodiles, drawn by the scent of blood and the thrashing of their victims, swarmed the helpless soldiers. British naturalist Bruce Wright, who was with the Marines on the perimeter, later described the scene. Motor launch crews ever experienced. The carnage was relentless, continuing throughout the long, dark night. The soldiers were trapped, with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. Climbing the slippery mangrove roots offered little protection, as the giant reptiles could lunge out of the water to snatch men from their precarious perches. There was no organized resistance possible. It was not a battle, but a slaughter. Every splash, every shadow, every ripple in the water was a source of terror. The soldiers were no longer a disciplined army unit. They were simply prey, isolated and hunted in the darkness by ancient, implacable predators. The rising sun revealed a scene of utter devastation. The black water was littered with debris, tattered pieces of uniforms, abandoned rifles, and things far more gruesome. The screaming had finally stopped. Of the nearly 1,000 soldiers who had entered the swamp the previous evening, only a handful emerged on the other side. The British patrols were shocked by the state of the survivors. They were wounded, covered in mud and blood, and in a deep state of psychological shock, babbling incoherently about the crocodiles. The official tally was grim. The British captured only about 20 survivors. It was estimated that nearly 500 soldiers had been taken by the crocodiles, with several hundred more perishing from disease, dehydration, or other hazards of the swamp. It was a military catastrophe of an almost unbelievable nature. The story of the Ramree Island massacre quickly became a chilling legend of the war. It served as a brutal reminder that in the remote theaters of conflict, the horrors of combat could be compounded by the unforgiving and often terrifying forces of nature, which were indifferent to human allegiances. For the British soldiers who stood guard that night, the memory was indelible. They had been spared the physical ordeal, but the sounds that emanated from the swamp, the symphony of terror, would haunt many of them for the rest of their lives. They were auditory witnesses to a massacre. The sheer scale of the incident, with hundreds of victims in a single night, remains unparalleled in the documented history of human-wildlife conflict. However, in recent years, the story has come under scrutiny. Some historians argue that the account, primarily sourced from Bruce Wright and a few others, may have been exaggerated. They suggest that while some soldiers likely fell victim to crocodiles, the vast majority probably died from dehydration, disease, and starvation. Local Burmese accounts from the time do not mention a crocodile attack of this magnitude, and official Japanese records of the battle are non-existent, likely lost in the chaos of the war's end. This lack of corroborating evidence has led many to classify the story as a wartime myth, a piece of battlefield folklore. Whether it was a literal massacre by 1,000 crocodiles or a tragic military retreat embellished into legend, the fate of the Japanese garrison on WWII Island remains one of World War II's most terrifying and mysterious tales. The truth, like the soldiers themselves, may have been swallowed by the swamp.